back, or they get bored with me prattling on or whatever, that's fine. Do come back at your convenience. I'd hope not to sort of go too far beyond one, but if it's interesting and people are still up for a bit more, then that's usually fine by me. The site itself, the Warden Hills, there are quite a few misconceptions about it really, and some of these have sort of grown into quite sort of major myths over the years. One of those is that it's Crown land. Well, it isn't. It is actually land that belongs to Luton Borough Council. We own the freehold of it. I've seen the deed, so I can vouch for that. There is a lot of Crown land in the area, but the whole of the Warden Hills isn't Crown land, though some parts of it used to be years ago. The land that does belong to the Crown is the golf course. The club actually lease the bulk of their land from them, and indeed the farmland at the top. The Shaw family lease land from the Crown as well. So this land all belongs to the Borough Council. It is all public open space for people to enjoy, but there are constraints on the land, consequent to the fact that it is a site of special scientific interest. And that means that it's in the Premier League, if you like, of wildlife sites in the country. You cannot have a more significant designation in Britain than being a site of special scientific interest. And the interest is predominantly with the flowers and the butterflies. And that means that English Nature, which is currently the government agency that deals with SSSIs, has a legal interest in this land. And even though I represent the council, work for the council in managing it, we cannot do things that English Nature wouldn't want to happen. So there are a lot of constraints. Now at the moment there are no pressures, for example, to build housing or whatever on this land, but there have been threats to it, the most obvious one being the Eastern Bypass extension, which has been talked about for very many years. I understand that first discussions about a route through this area were made right the way back in the 1930s. And every now and again it's sort of become a talking point again, and people have done a bit of work on it, and then for whatever reason it sort of died away again. Where we are with that at the moment is that because of all this South Midlands growth area business, the whole of the road scheme is actually being re-looked at. And although the favoured route for the road in the past was actually across this field, it now seems more likely that a route further out and around the back of the hills is likely to be chosen. I think what is certain is that sooner or later some sort of road around the eastern edge of Luton is going to be built. A little while ago, a few years ago, I thought that that was quite unlikely, but with all the extra housing that is going to be built on the edge of Luton, it's going to be very necessary, I think, to have the infrastructure, and that means that this road is, I think, virtually certain. It may not be for 10 years, it may be even longer than that, who knows, but I think that sooner or later it's going to come. So what that tells us really is, even though this land is the most important designation for wildlife that any piece of land in Britain can have, it is still not wholly safe from something dreadful happening to it. So how do we prevent that from happening? Well, the first thing we have to do is to manage the land appropriately. And all the management is worked out with English Nature, and those of you who know the hills well will know that we have grazing on those spaces and the steep slopes. Normally we have cattle grazing there in the winter months. I imagine from around about October we'll have our little herd of Dexters back again, little friendly cows. They're not so friendly over here, they don't meet with the public so much, but there's certainly nothing to be afraid of, and they're only about that sort of kind. The ones we normally have on here are actually only yearlings, so they're quite cute really. But they do a good job in actually managing the slopes. And the field here that we're on, which is also part of the SSSI, this is cut annually hay. That's actually contracted out to a local farmer who will come and do the hay cut at some point. I would imagine, again, probably around about October. Some years when it's been excessively dry, this field gets very, very scorched. You get very concerned that it's going to go up in flames. As indeed it has done once or twice, or parts of it. This year with the rather more unpredictable weather, we've not had that problem, so there's certainly no pressure at the moment to cut it early. The advantage of cutting it late is of course that all the flowers that are currently in flower will get the chance to finish flowering and to set seed. Cut it too early, you risk wiping out some of the later flowering species. If you cut it too late, then there's also obviously the risk that you might get autumn downpours and so on, which flatten it and make it much more difficult to cut and get the hay off. Also, the hay is less valuable to farmers the longer it's left, so it goes down in nutrient value. So getting that balance right sort of varies really from year to year. But certainly before the autumn really sets in, that this will be cut for hay and all the hay taken away. Well, why do we do that? Well, the hay is taken away because that helps to reduce the nutrients in the field. And the important thing about all of these chalk habitats is that you don't want nutrients to build up. You start getting nutrient build up, you start getting coarse vegetation, like you can see here. You'll get thistles, you'll get nettles, you'll get docks, all of those kind of coarse plants that you don't want to grow on a calcareous meadow. One of the problems in managing this site is the impact that we have of dog poo, which of course is having the opposite effect. And you'll notice, particularly it's cut slightly earlier in the year, a lush green strip on either side of all of these paths. And that is the result of the many years of accumulation of dog poo fertilising the edges of all these paths. So you'll see that the grass is a bit higher and it's a bit lusher, and you move away and it's not quite so lush. You can't see it quite so much at this time of year, but it's an important factor. So we want to keep the nutrient levels generally on the soil low. It's probably fair to say that this field is the most important calcareous meadow anywhere in the county. We've actually got quite a stack of bits of steep downland, like the hills themselves. They have survived obviously because they're very steep, they don't make good arable fields, they're not good for building on, so we've got Warden Galley Hills, Barton Hills, Sharpenhoe Clappers, ad infinitum almost. What we haven't got are these lowland fields, because most of these have either been ploughed, built on, or fertilised to increase their grazing productivity. So this field is now an extremely rare landscape feature. So that's a sort of introduction really to the site. What I'd like to do is, I think for the first little while, have a look at some of the species that we can see on the field, so we can see how rich it actually is, and how various parts of it vary. We filmed it as being a walk to see a few butterflies as well as flowers. They're all here, and if the sun comes out, they will all go whoosh up into the air. The most common British butterfly is this one. It's called the meadow brown. Most people don't realise that it's very common because it's not a species that you often find in the garden. It's a species that likes open grassland, and like all the brown butterflies, it's very unspecific about the food plants that the caterpillars will eat. And that is why the browns, things like the meadow brown, the ringlet, the gatekeeper, are some of our most common species. So that is, throughout Britain, regarded as the commonest British butterfly. With a bit of luck, especially if the breeze drops and we get some sun coming out, we should start to see rather more butterflies flying. August is around about the last month that you're going to see many of the butterflies. A few of those that hibernate. There are not many butterfly species in Britain that do hibernate, but they will be around into September and occasionally even into October. But a lot of them, the adults will have died off by the end of August, and the whole butterflies species will survive either as an overwintering egg or an overwintering pupa, depending on what species you're looking at. So if you see these ones, the seed are beginning to ripen. This is the same thing here, still in the flower. And this, of course, is the wild carrot, from which all our domesticated carrots, as domesticated is the word, have been derived. Very common plant on calcareous land generally. Lots of them about here. Characteristics of them, particularly when they start to set seed, the umbel, which is the flower head, actually sort of starts to it kind of clenches itself up a bit like a sort of fist, and it sort of starts off flat and then it gradually sort of encloses itself and forms sort of a cup shape. That's what you can see there. There's not really a really that one. There's a microhabitat being formed. So that's the wild carrot. Another plant that I can see quite a few of down here is this one. This is a thing called red bartzia. From a distance it looks a bit like a heather, those sort of little pinky mauve flowers. That's actually a calcareous plant that doesn't mind being trampled. That's why we can see there's quite a few of these along the edge of the path here. So those are two of the fairly common ones. And third one, which there's an awful lot of, is this one, which is the black knapweed. There are two knapweeds. This is the more common of the two. Common knapweed or black knapweed, and it's the one known as hardheads. And I don't know whether children still do, but in the old days they used to pick those off and use them like conkers with a sort of little hard bit on the end, and they would sort of whack each other with them. All sorts of unspeakable things that children get up to. I won't say too much about these horrible yellow things. We'll say they are belong to the dandelion family. That would be sufficient, I think. There are a lot of these. These are probably things like autumn hawk bits and so on, but they're fairly common, not especially interesting. And here is another common plant. This is the ribworked plantain. Got these long, very ribbed leaves, and that is the flower head of that particular plantain. Those are the flowers there, and that is it as it's setting. So this is a plant, an undesirable one. This is ragwort. Now, ragwort is very poisonous, particularly to livestock, and conservation organisations and other landowners spend quite a lot of time pulling that one up, because if you allow it to flourish on areas that are to be grazed, over a period of time it will build up toxins in the grazing animal's liver. It's particularly unpleasant for horses. Now sadly, over the last few years there's been an increasing amount of ragworm about in the countryside, and it is a responsibility of landowners to actually pull it up and get rid of it. But unfortunately a lot of landowners don't do that. I suppose possibly rail track are the main offenders. I don't think they see it as a priority. They have a lot of open waste land that these plants can get established on. Yet, you know, if they're looking to meet their timetabling requirements, that's probably the last thing they're going to be bothered about, frankly. They're reasonably common in the countryside still, and they are not specific to the kind of habitat that this site can produce. Now, if we moved on to here, we're really now beginning to start to see a wider range of more interesting flowers coming in. So where we are here, we've got this one, which is kidney vetch. This is a late flowering example here. You can always tell kidney vetch because the flower heads, they're sort of set in this kind of hairy looking mass there at the top. Now, this is a plant of well-drained calcareous soils. You will find it on chalk, you will occasionally find it on coastal sand dunes and places like that, particularly where you've got a high shell content in the sand. They do like it to be nice and chalky. The important thing about this flower is that it's the food plant for one of the blue butterflies, the small blue. So without the kidney vetch, you would not expect to get a colony of the small blue. And the female butterfly, which is only about the size of a couple of, if you put your two sort of little fingernails together, very small butterfly, the female will actually lay its eggs in one of those flower heads, and the caterpillar, tiny as though it is, will spend its life within the flower head of the kidney vetch.
Funny you should say that, because I've got two. I've noticed that actually I've got a little blue butterfly, and I've got a patch of something like that. This one I bought in the garden nurseries. And in the afternoon she seen this little blue butterfly coming along.
Right.
And I said to Rob about it actually, but I don't know whether there's one or two because they all seem to look when they come down. Yeah. But it floats around the side of the garden.
Don't you lose the eggs and the caterpillars when you mow for May?
Well, when the caterpillars have grown, they will then pupate, and they drop out of the flower head and pupate on the ground.
Before you mow.
Yeah.
So you don't mow too early, you lose them.
Well, you won't mow mine because mine is over in the shed.
But that's, you know, a very simple ecological relationship. I mean, a lot of ecological relationships are not well understood, but that's a very straightforward one. If you haven't got that plant, you're not going to have that butterfly. So,
is it fairly rare?
It is fairly scarce. One of the old names for it, interestingly enough, was the Bedford Blue, because there are quite a few localities in Bedfordshire where it was known. But the problem with that particular butterfly, and one of the problems with it, is that it forms small colonies and it's not a good flyer. It stays very local. It's not one of these butterfly Rice Krispie grass, because of the little seed heads look a bit like Rice Krispies when they dry up. And that is a much more interesting and more delicate grass species you get. It's this one here. That's a quaking grass. Rhiza media.
Oh, these go brown in the end. Finishing up.
They
brownish.
Yeah, they probably will brown off a little bit more as the season progresses.
I remember just tried an Ireland.
What's this plant?
That looks very much like it's the flower of a stemless thistle. The one we call a picnic thistle. Because it's the one that you never see until you sit on it.
You don't see it, you feel it.
That's right. Now, it's called a stemless thistle for obvious reasons, if you like. I mean, we're all used to thistles growing up tall with a nice big thistle flower on the top. This one just doesn't do that, and that goes back to what I was saying about how a lot of these plants are adapted to being grazed. It doesn't have a stem, the whole thing is just a rosette on the ground, and you can see there that is the flower head. But if you were to sit on those prickly leaves there that belong to it, you would certainly know about it, because they are really quite prickly and nasty.
I think you'll find I've got one in the dustbin, Rob.
Right,
Put my wildflower encyclopedia.
another plant of the pea family, like the clovers and so on. Now, one of the names, I never knew it as bacon and eggs when I was young, so I mean I think some of these names still are quite regional. But this is the bird's foot trefoil, and when the plant is in bud, the flowers are a kind of a pinky sort of colour, a bit like a rasher of bacon. And then as they open into full flower, the flowers are bright yellow like that one, like an egg yolk. So hence bacon and eggs.
It's too soft.
That one is a bit, yes, that's the aberrant one, of course, that is outside its normal colour range, just to make things awkward. There's always one, yeah. Or two.
There's another one over here, yes, it must be a little patch.
But yeah, there's a few there as well. Yeah, that's right, it's the leaflets. You get these sometimes in flower well into the autumn. So even I think as late as November I've seen the occasional one in flower. So you're almost certain to lose a few of those when the hay cut is taken. But we're in very much more a very typical bit of chalk grassland here. And you'll notice that the grasses are less productive. We've lost some of those coarser plants. Not got so much of the carrot, the black knapweed and that sort of thing. And this is the kind of thing that I suppose is what you're aiming for when you're managing these kind of chalk grasslands. One of the principal field boundary divisions is along where those three beech trees are over there. That was a hedge line, and from just this side of that beech tree there was another hedge line which came along here over into that point, sort of roughly where that big hawthorn is over there on the golf course boundary. That area there, above that, was an arable field. There was another arable field in the bit that we first looked at where the car park is. All that's left of that now is a triangle, because half of that is now underneath the golf course. It's a rectangular field, but the boundary has kind of cut that into two. The L-shaped bit of common includes the strip from here down to those houses, and it goes right the way up the southern edge of this field and back up to the hillsides over there. And because we know that that was never ever ploughed, we also know that it was traditionally grazed. Even in the early years of the golf course, we've got photographs of the golf course managing the course by grazing it with sheep. So you can actually see various features of the golf course, and see some more bits and pieces of that as we go round.
There was a building somewhere around here, wasn't there? Was it a farmhouse?
It was.
Farm building, I remember it.
That's right. The original farmhouse, which was called Warden Hill Farm, actually stood where that big clump of bushes is over there. You can have a look at that. You can actually still see the well there in the ground, and that was the farmhouse. But because this was common, it was never allowed to be ploughed up. So it went out of production long before artificial fertilisers and things were produced. So the most fertilisation it could ever have had would just been a bit of manuring, and that would have been way back in the 19th century. So it's been pretty much undisturbed. And that's one of the reasons why the more interesting areas of grassland were on land that was never ploughed, as opposed to bits that had been ploughed have since reverted back to grassland. So that is, we can safely say that this is unimproved grassland from that point of view, whereas we can only say that the bits of this field that we know were ploughed in the 19th century are what are known as semi-improved. In fact, they reverted back to grassland from the top field. The fungi, I expect.
This seems to be quite early this year.
What else have we got here? This is nice. This is salad burnet. That's the leaves of salad burnet there. This is actually quite edible. It tastes, to me, it tastes sort of like a sort of quite strong cucumbery flavour, slightly peppery sort of flavour. A bit like unripe courgettes or something. Just an acquired taste. I'm not sure there's be much of a market for it these days. But that unpleasant, it's fairly strong. And the other thing that we see in here is nature trying to revert our lovely bit of chalk grassland back to woodland. And this is a hawthorn. Now, those who are involved in conservation locally would regard that as an enemy worse than Al-Qaeda. The hawthorn, which has really come originally from all the hedgerows around, produces millions of berries every autumn, and the berries are spread by birds and small mammals and so on onto practically any bit of open ground, grassland, where they germinate and they produce little seedlings like this. Now, if it wasn't for the fact that this field was cut each year, they would very rapidly grow up into bushes, and we'd end up with the sort of state of affairs that you can see up there on the hills, which is probably, at most chalk grassland sites, a bigger threat to the survival of these sorts of flowers that we've been looking at than development projects or anything else. There's more chalk grassland has been lost to neglect and scrub development in Bedfordshire certainly, and no doubt everywhere else, than has been lost in historic times to any other of man's activities. Now, when grazing ceased on these sites, which was, as I said, around about the time of the Second World War, all of these little seedlings just went whoosh. So in the 50s, people didn't really notice it too much. In the 60s, most of these sites were starting to become covered by bushes. By the end of the 70s, people were getting very worried about it, and in the 80s they decided to do something about it. And that was really the process that led to me being in the job that I am now. Because in the late 1980s, Luton Borough Council were informed by English Nature that you are neglecting your SSSI, or allowing it to deteriorate, and you need to do something about it. And as a result of that, they incorporated into the Bushmead development the funding to build the field centre, which is where I'm based, and the post, my post, was created to actually manage this site and to reverse the decline that had been observed. So that was where I kind of came in. And so that was in 1990 when I first started, so I've been doing that job now for about 14 years. It's interesting though, you can see here just on this little specimen how it has been cut at least once in the hay cut, which has prevented it from getting away, and if I hadn't just pulled it up, no doubt it would have been topped again. But it hasn't killed it, and it was sort of sitting there waiting to shoot up as soon as it had the chance. So if we lose a season's grazing or a season's hay cutting for any reason, conservation terms, that is a very bad thing.
I suppose they get a bit tougher, the hay cut wouldn't be able to take.
They're a nightmare to get up out of the ground as well. Absolute nightmare, because I've got them growing alongside my garden. And the flipping things are everywhere. You get plants, and then all of a sudden you've got one of those that's about 8 feet.
Now I mentioned that this field once was divided into 3, And we can actually see, if you like, the kind of ghost of that field pattern just by looking at the vegetation that there is now. You might notice we're sort of standing here on a slight hump. And this was the line of one of these hedgerows. And it actually, you can pick it out because we've got this coarser vegetation that would have been in the base of the hedgerow, perhaps representing a bit more enrichment by all the, the coarser plants and the leaf fall and so on, going in that direction. And you can actually pick that out by this sort of band of the knapweeds and the carrot and so on. It's here, and these are actually the relics of old golf bunkers. So interestingly enough, we've got these little hollows, which are still from the day when they were abandoned, full of sand. And that would have been around about 30 years ago now. You can actually see sand quite near the surface in here, just left in the base of the bunkers from the day it was abandoned. It doesn't seem to have produced any particularly exciting flora, despite the fact it obviously gives a very different ground condition. But it has actually interrupted the original hedge line that sort of stretched up here. But it'll be interesting to see in years to come whether it does become colonised by any plants that are more characteristic of the green sand, for example. You could well imagine, in an area like this, that the heathers and things would do well. The difficulty is how would they actually get here? Not only wind-blown seed or whatever. Colonise them. Quite a bit of moss, yeah. That's what these features are. And reading the landscape up here is actually quite an art in itself, because we've got all these different features from different periods in the landscape history, all are kind of overlapping each other. And that's what this is, and there's another one just there. One plant we haven't seen so far, this is the greater knapweed. That's the other knapweed there. Much taller plant. It's got a pinnate leaf, whereas the common knapweed has got a much more simple shaped leaf. You can see. So that's the greater knapweed. The greater knapweed is quite important on this site because it's the host of a rare parasitic plant called the knapweed broom rape. And that will be one of the things that I'll be looking at over on the far edge of the site. It's one of the more unusual plants we get here. The area that was cultivated, the farmhouse was just over there in amongst those bushes. And this is one other flower here we've not seen so far. Another later summer species. It's the field scabious. Sort of very delicate mauve colour. Yeah, very attractive coloured flower.
And what an amazing difference there is.
Rather more of those, but there's
Trevor,
more over here.
Trevor,
Right.
where the ground has been sort of made richer there, where that house was, it's just completely different, isn't it? It's like a mouse.
Yeah. You notice it with the scrub as well. I mean, elder, for example, is nearly always grows in an area of enrichment. You tend not to get elder scrub on the downs, on the thinner soils, but in an area around human habitation or where there's been large-scale rabbit activity or other animal activity, you'll get elder from areas like that, where again it's very enriched. But, that is what this would revert back to. One of the things we notice on a lot of our sites in Luton, where we have got people that back onto them, their own domestic properties, they very often use the open land to tip their garden rubbish on, which is not necessary, especially these days if you've got a brown wheelie bin. But the rotting of that kind of vegetation will change the soil very, very rapidly to conditions that will generate that kind of growth. So it really is something that we aren't very happy about at all. A lot of people think that that's not a problem because they say, oh, it will rot down, why is it a problem? The grass cuttings come over and the old prunings and weeds they've dug up out in their flower beds or whatever. But in fact, in some ways, it's worse than ordinary fly tipping because it's actually altering the quality of the soil itself. If they threw a pile of old bricks over or a bit of old timber, you can pick it up and take it away. But once something's rotted into the soil, it will have changed that soil for, I'd hesitate to say forever, but it's changed for a long period of time. And that area there is, as you can see, completely different, and that was where the farmhouse used to stand. So I mean that's basically left these days anyway. It's not cut because there's rubble and that in there, and farmers can't get in to cut it. And you can hear it absolutely teeming with birds, yeah. So it's quite nice to leave it, just kind of habitat. On now, but that's the remains of the seed head. But it's very closely related to the commercial flax that gives us linseed and linen, of course, as well.
It's a lint down.
Yeah, the lint used to have as well as far as But my uncles and that used to go and pull it. They used to pull it by hand.
Did they?
Come home.
Yeah.
Most of the house.
Really?
And black as the ace of spades.
Really?
Yeah.
Throw into these small lakes that rotted. Get the fibre out of it.
That's right. Yeah. In fact, funnily enough, a colleague of mine who now works for the Ministry of Defence actually, but his PhD project was looking at the fungi that cause the rot of the flax. They call it retting, don't they? Yeah. And he was looking at the various fungi that trying to speed that process up, because one of the the costs in linen production is how long it takes for them to get the fibres out.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was actually did his doctoral thesis on that process
What an interesting thing.
at the Queen's University in Belfast.
Yeah.
It's over there. He was a Luton lad. I mean, he had no Irish connections, but he just did his PhD over there and then came back. And then he started. As I say, he works for the MOD now he's quite a senior civil servant. But his first job with the MOD, what he was looking at then was how fuel storage got contaminated by fungi and how the fuel was ruined by fungi and that getting in it. And that was how his career went, from looking at the fungi attacking the flax plants to the fungi attacking the fuel in long-term sort of storage facilities for the MOD. And that was how he started his career in that. So it's odd how people's careers can go in different directions.
I know that the birds, sometimes I get one from the other. It looks like something in the garden or that.
Like pansies and line buttercups. Obvious ones like that.
Warden Hill Farm. The farm buildings are actually in there. You'll see there are lumps of old rubble and so on left. It must have been around about 30 years ago, I think, when this was demolished. And when we took over this site, we didn't know that this was here. And I actually mentioned at the beginning of the walk how occasionally we've had trouble with these fields being set light to or catching fire. And in one of the very hot summers in the early 90s, it might be 91, there was quite a serious fire here in the middle of August, around about this time of year I would guess. And a fireman fell down this while he was beating out the fire. And that was the first we knew that it was still here. So we actually, to begin with, what we thought we'd do is to make a nice feature of it. So we made a little circle about a foot or so high of nice granite sets, and then put the grid over the top of that to make a nice feature. But unfortunately, somebody nicked them.
Oh dear.
The whole lot just vanished, disappeared completely. So someone's got a nice granite rockery in the area now. So we couldn't afford to get that done again, so we thought, well, we obviously got to make it safe, so we just put the steel grill over the top so that people didn't fall in. As you can see, I mean, it's pretty much, well, it makes you wonder. But I mean, the whole thing was cemented, all the sets were, you know, it's like a little, you know, well wall around it, and it just vanished. So, we don't, yeah, we don't know. I mean, it might be what was called a dumb well, which may mean that it was just water stored in there. But the golf course still has its own borehole to water the golf course, so it may not have had to go down that far to get water. But we've only known it like this. But of course the chalk, you know, holds all the water like a sponge. Has anyone ever been to Dell Farm? Anyone know Dell Farm over Whipsnade? Those houses which they sold up for development. And that was all around about the 1970s, mid-1970s. The club and the council Crown Estate did a complicated land deal whereby the course was able to extend further in that direction, and this piece of land became available as part of the open space for the public, and was subsequently added to the SSSI as well. So we have got a number of sort of golf course relics still here, and we've also got some of the golf course planting still about as well. That clump of trees over there, for example, was all part of the club landscaping. That was all planted. Some dates from that period of the site's history. So this is actually the green here, and you can see how, again, the habitat's very different. As we move off this onto this area of the side over here, we go back onto the old undisturbed common land, and again some of the very best of the plants, interesting areas of habitat occur on that piece of habitat. We've seen most of the things I would expect to see out in flower this time of year, but there are still a couple which we might find in abundance over there, one of which is the clustered feldflower, another campanula, a nice sort of deeper purple flower than the harebell, and this parasitic plant, the knapweed broom rape, which also occurs over there with its host plant as well. There's another plant which does grow over there, and it's the only site in Bedfordshire for it. That's something called the purple milkvet, but that's an early flowering species in May, and at this time of the year it will have died back completely, so there won't be anything of that to see. But that particular piece of ground has got 3 of the 4 most important plant species on the whole site, just on that area there. So this field is certainly as important, if not more so in some ways, than the actual hills itself. And as I said at the beginning of the walk, it's actually rarer to have a short meadow area like this than it is to have a short downy hillside like we've got there. So let's just have a look. 1 or 2 other trees of interest over here. There's a nice birch tree over there, which is quite unusual to find on its short. Whether that's self-set or planted by the club, I don't know. And similarly there, we've got a pear tree, which is another unusual thing to find, and that could be a planted specimen, or it might be it's just grown up from somebody's pear core that they threw away. So that's the pear that's there. Rather straggly looking one.
Well, there was those people past the old footpath.
I knew last year was
The old footpath up the
Yeah,
Well, that's the brambles.
This is the on the SSSI citation this site has. It's basically an official sort of paragraph or two which just spells out why English Nature thinks that this site is very important. It refers be widespread on the site, but is gone over and is not going to be easy to spot this time of year. Something called the field fleawort, which is a little yellow, slightly dandelion-y looking type of thing, which doesn't grow on Warden Hill, grows over on Galley Hill. The purple milk vetch, which is the little vetchy thing, which has got a nice mauvey flower that flowers in May, and that's all down over there. It's about the only patch of it left in the county. And the fourth is this one, which is called the knapweed broomrape. It's called broomrape because one of the species in the family parasitises broom, which is a plant very similar to gorse without the prickles on it. So this one is not a broomrape in that sense. Its host plant is the greater knapweed, and this is the greater knapweed. It is being parasitised. So how much bigger that would be if it didn't have one of these growing on it, I don't know. That's the host, and you can see it's a fairly small, diminished looking thing now. Now, the numbers of these over here vary from year to year. They come up in around about June, and they're sort of just a pale, sort of greeny colour, sometimes sort of slightly flushed, sort of like pinky bronzy sort of colour. Sometimes they're just very pale, and they turn brown, and they stay like that over winter, so you can see them quite long into the winter months. But that's it, that is all of it. I mean, it doesn't have conventional leaves, it's all its nutrients from the host plant, which is this one here.
So that's a flower spike?
Yeah, that's the flower spike.
And it has seeds and everything in the way.
That is it. Now there's only around about maybe half a dozen localities for that in the county, maybe, something like that. It's fairly scarce. It does occur over at Blowsdown, and along by the old, well, certainly the old railway line over at Chall End. There used to be a few over there. Now this is the clustered bellflower. It's another campanula. So it's related to the harebell, but it's got a much deeper flower, as you can see there. All of these heads have gone over, so these are actually forming seed now, and that's the last of the flower that is still to go over. You can see there's another one there, there's a clump there, one there, here. So a couple of weeks ago they would have been in full flower, quite spectacular, but just catching the last of those now, which is supposed to help germination. I've also heard it said that if you just very finely get some fine sandpaper and just rub the seeds gently with that, just to scarify the surface of the seed, that helps them to germinate as well. That's how flower rich these areas are, and that's why they are so important. And here again we've got mostly the common stuff that we saw earlier on, black knapweed, wild carrot and so on, all the pork weeds. We've also got yarrow, which is this one here. You probably know that, Achillea millefolium. Some of you may know that as a garden plant. Generally white, sometimes slightly flushed with pink. And the other one that we've got here is silverweed, which is a potentilla. And again, if you're a gardener, you probably know the potentillas as shrubs, but there are a number of potentillas which are herb species, no woody growth on them at all. They include that one and the creeping cinquefoil, which I saw over here as well. colonising this old molehill there. You can see how creeping it is. It's just crept out across the bare ground there. Called a cinquefoil because it has 5 little leaflets to a leaf. And that will have little yellow flowers on it. Very, very similar to the flowers that you get on the potentilla bushes that are very common in people's gardens. So that's another one. Another plant there's quite a lot of in that area there is this tall, rather scruffy looking thing called mugwort. And that is mainly a disturbed ground species. And the reason that it's doing quite well in that area is because 3 or 4 years ago we actually changed the line of that fence and brought it out a little bit further because we were getting a lot of vandalism down in that corner previously. So we realigned it and moved the kissing gate from about there to there, and that is just the effect of the ground disturbance. Having done that has allowed different plant species to colonise, and most of those are actually in that fence line where it used to run. So that's mugwort. It's very much a coarse, disturbed ground plant. There's an awful lot of that around the cattle trough as well, which we might see in a bit later on. So if everyone's up for it, we'll go up this path
As long as there's no prize for
to the
getting there
top.
quick.
People moving.
That's a green.
Yeah.
Okay, well, one of the high points. View to the north, across Luton towards Dunstable, you can certainly see Dunstable over there. And also, I hope you noticed when we came up the effect of all the erosion of people's feet from the trampling on the vegetation. And one of the things that have opened space, so there are discussions going on at quite a high level as to what the long-term future of all the land in this area is likely to be. So although there's going to be a lot more building, one of the consequences of the building might be that we actually get a lot more open space to go with it. And there's certainly been one idea floated that we have a very large country park over in this area, which might take in this hill and Bradger's Hill and link up the hills by taking that land out of arable production. The downside of that scheme is that they might allow additional building down here on the flat and possibly additional building out there on New Farm. That's New Farm, you can see down there. And beyond that there's the Swedish cottages and then Lily. The original plans only envisaged additional housing on the far side of the A6. It is actually the Crown Estates who are promoting development on this side because they own it and no doubt they want to make money. And it's the proposals that have been put forward, which I've not been consulted on formally, but I have actually seen them, is very much a curate's egg, if you like. There are some much cherished ambitions in there, like linking Bradger's Hill and Warden Hill together, but the cost in terms of additional housing will be quite a spectacular incursion onto this landscape as well. So I'm very much in two minds about what I think about that. I'm going to have very little say in what happens. There's going to be a big development corporation that will actually deliver both the housing and the infrastructure that will be needed for the housing. But that does include what the trendy term which is being bandied about now is green infrastructure, and that basically means that people like us have got a say, because green infrastructure is thought now as being as important as roads and and the other infrastructure as well. So provision of open space and not just a few pocket-sized parks, but decent areas of countryside for recreation is very much a part of the thinking. But those of us who are used to Luton sort of ending at the borough boundary, where it does at the moment, are going to find in 10, 20 years' time it's going to look a lot different now from this viewpoint than it does today. Plus the road as well. I mean, there's certainly going to be a northern bypass. We'll cut around there as well. That's the large building behind that big square building. That's the old Vauxhall Distribution Centre on Toddington Road. And looking further afield, if you look at the end one of the 3 flats at Marsh Farm, just behind that you can see the sort of cliff at the edge of Outreach's Quarry, right in the distance there. And you can normally pick out Dunstable, you can see the water tower over in Dunstable, which is just below the horizon. We're high up. I'm used to seeing it on the horizon, but because of our angle it's just below. You can see a sort of like a dome structure over there. That's Dunstable. The industrial estates are. You've got Blowsdown running there along the horizon. Then you get to the L&D over there. Behind that you've got the Dallow Downs with the 2 masts on it, and then running round just below that you can see the town hall, the town centre over there. You can see the top of the West Street water tower, the triangle on the horizon there. And on this side there's the Hart Lane water tower, and then you can see Stomsley High School, Regional Sports Centre, of course the airport control tower. So you can see quite a panorama of the area up here. It's quite a nice spot. And in terms of the other habitats, Bradgers Hill, which is the other undeveloped area of hillside there. It's got very much similar importance to Warden Hill. It's not a SSSI at the moment. It has recently been resurveyed, and there has been a recommendation made that it should become a site of special scientific interest. And, whether that will come to pass in the next year or two, we'll have to wait and see, but the recommendation is certainly there. It's a very important bit of chalk habitat as well. And in between Bradgers Hill and here at the moment, of course, we've got farmland. That's all farmed from Whitehill Farm. It's the Shaw family's tenancy. They've been farming the land for about 3 or 4 generations. And the farmer today is Lionel Shaw, who farms the land that used to belong both to Manor Farm and to Whitehill Farm. And basically farms everything from the Hitchin Road, the A505, right out as far as the Icknield Way, at the far end of Galley Hill. So it's a very big holding, a very big, mostly arable farm. It's got a few cows, but it's nearly all arable. Down by the river, you've got very enriched, quite a good quality loam, a nice dark soil that's very, good for growing things. A lot of the allotments, Moat Lane and Limby Meads and places like that are all down on these really rich soils. him growing crops on it would theoretically be illegal. He's not got a consent from English Nature Society for this, 5 metre strip or whatever. So, there's lots of things like that which make it very, very complicated. The other complication is the fact that although the land is owned by Luton Borough, the planning authority is South Bed District. We're actually in Stretton here, we've got England in Stretton. Interestingly enough. So although Luton owned the land, the idea that you're so close to Luton sort of just totally disappears when you're up there. And Little Galley Hill is very good for orchids and some of the other areas of botanical interest. But that's really for another day. This area here is worth noticing because of the effects of the rabbit population. You can see how all the grass has been nibbled right the way down. They don't seem to like eating the knapweeds. But rabbits are a perennial problem on these sites, and they have been growing in numbers recently. And you can see there's a lot of evidence of rabbits in this particular area here. And you can see the impact that has. Eventually, if it gets too bad, they will dig up so much soil here that you'll get